Midnight calls. The hum of the broadcasting studio was a sound Jack Harlan knew intimately. At 11:57 p.m., the small, cluttered room was his kingdom. Stacks of CDs, scribbled notes, and an old coffee mug sat on the desk, while the red on-air sign glowed softly in the dim light. Jack had been hosting the Midnight Hour for 5 years, a late-night talk show where insomniacs, truckers, and night owls called in to share their stories or request their favorite songs. The job wasn't glamorous, but it was steady. Jack liked the quiet rhythm of the graveyard shift. There were no producers breathing down his neck, and he could indulge his love for obscure jazz tracks between callers. At the stroke of midnight, Jack leaned into the microphone, his deep, soothing voice filling the airwaves. Good evening, night owls. This is the Midnight Hour with Jack Harlan. The lines are open, so give me a call. What's on your mind tonight? He hit a button, and the soft strains of Miles Davis's Kind of Blue played in the background. Jack sat back, sipping his lukewarm coffee, waiting for the first call to come in. The phone lines usually lit up within minutes, but tonight they stayed eerily quiet. 10 minutes passed. Then 15. Jack frowned, tapping his pen against the desk. He was about to cue up another song when the phone rang. A shrill sound that cut through the silence. He quickly adjusted his headset and pressed the button. You're on the Midnight Hour. This is Jack. Who's calling? There was a long pause, followed by static. Jack's brow furrowed. Hello? Can you hear me? A voice finally came through, soft and trembling. Is this Jack Harlan? That's me, Jack replied, his tone warm. Who am I speaking with? Sarah, the caller said, her voice barely above a whisper. Sarah Connelly. Jack's pen hovered over his notepad. Something about the name tugged at his memory, but he couldn't place it. What's on your mind tonight, Sarah? I've been trying to reach you, she said, her tone urgent. I need your help. Jack straightened in his chair. What kind of help? Before she could answer, the line went dead. Jack stared at the phone, his heart pounding. He had dealt with plenty of odd callers over the years. Pranksters, conspiracy theorists, even a guy who claimed he'd been abducted by aliens. But something about Sarah's voice unsettled him. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, but Jack couldn't shake the call. After his shift ended, he lingered in the studio, replaying the recording of the broadcast. Sarah's voice was there, soft and trembling, but her words were drowned in faint static. He listened closely, trying to decipher anything he'd missed, but the line going dead cut her off abruptly. By the time he left the studio, the sun was rising over the city, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. Jack decided to let it go. Late-night radio attracted strange people. Sarah Connelly was probably just another lonely soul with a story to tell. The next night, Jack returned to the studio, his coffee steaming in the mug he'd forgotten to clean. The evening began like any other. Callers chatted about everything from their favorite songs to ghost stories. Jack enjoyed the easy flow of conversation, his thoughts of Sarah fading into the background. But just past 2 a.m., the phone rang again, and a chill ran down his spine as he recognized the faint static on the line. You're on the Midnight Hour. This is Jack, he said cautiously. It's Sarah, the voice said. Jack leaned forward, gripping the microphone. Sarah? I thought we got cut off last night. I need your help, she said again, her voice tinged with desperation. Jack's pulse quickened. Tell me what's going on. Where are you? There was a long pause. I don't know, she said finally. It's so dark here. A shiver ran through Jack. Sarah, are you in danger? Should I call someone? No one can help me, she said. Not anymore, but you can. Jack's hand tightened around his pen. How? What do you need me to do? Before she could answer, the line crackled and her voice faded into static once more. Jack swore under his breath, staring at the phone as if willing it to ring again. When his shift ended, Jack didn't go home. Instead, he went to the small diner down the street, his usual post-show haunt. The place was quiet, the only sound the clink of plates and the soft hum of the jukebox in the corner. As he sipped his coffee, he pulled out his phone and typed Sarah Connelly into a search engine. Dozens of results popped up, but one article caught his attention. It was an obituary from 1977. Sarah Connelly, 23, had disappeared while walking home from her job at a local diner. Her body had been found weeks later in a nearby park. Her death ruled a homicide. The killer was never caught. Jack stared at the screen, his coffee growing cold in his hands. It couldn't be the same Sarah. The woman he'd spoken to sounded real, alive. But the obituary nagged at him, the details aligning too perfectly to ignore. Whoever or whatever had called him wasn't just another lonely voice in the night. Sarah Connelly had a story to tell, and Jack was determined to uncover the truth. Jack Harlan didn't sleep that morning. The obituary he'd found about Sarah Connelly lingered in his mind like a dark cloud. It wasn't just the uncanny match between her name and the caller. It was the chilling realization that the woman who had called him twice had been dead for over 40 years. He spent the day scouring the internet for more information. Articles about Sarah's case painted a picture of a quiet, hardworking young woman. She had worked at a diner on the edge of town, often taking late shifts to help support her family. The details of her death were sparse, but the few that emerged were grim. She'd been found strangled in a park not far from the radio station where Jack now worked. The case had gone cold, leaving her family with no answers. Jack couldn't shake the feeling that she'd called him for a reason. But how? And why? That night, Jack returned to the station, his usual routine overshadowed by unease. He set up his playlist and prepared for another shift, though his mind was miles away. He couldn't tell anyone about what had happened. Not yet. Who would believe him? The first hour passed without incident. Jack spoke to a caller who wanted to talk about their favorite conspiracy theories, another who requested a jazz classic, and a trucker who shared a strange UFO sighting. It was business as usual, and Jack began to relax. Then, at 1:13 a.m., the phone rang again. Jack hesitated before answering, his hand hovering over the button. He exhaled slowly and pressed it. "You're on the midnight hour. This is Jack." At first, there was nothing but static. Then, a new voice crackled through the line. It was male, deep and shaky, with an edge of desperation. "Jack, is that you?" Jack's heart pounded. "Yes, this is Jack. Who am I speaking with?" "Michael. Michael Carter." Jack scribbled the name on his notepad. "What's on your mind tonight, Michael?" The voice trembled. "I think I made a mistake. I shouldn't have gone out that night. I thought I could make it home." Jack frowned. "What are you talking about? Where are you calling from?" "I don't know," Michael replied, his voice breaking. "It's so cold here, so dark." Jack froze. The words mirrored Sarah's almost exactly. "Michael, when did this happen? What night are you talking about?" "January 14th, 1983, Michael said, his voice fading into static. Jack stared at the phone in disbelief. "Michael, are you?" The line went dead. Jack leaned back in his chair, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Another name, another ghost. He immediately searched online for Michael Carter and January 14th, 1983. Within minutes, he found an old news article. Michael Carter, 32, had been struck by a car while walking home late at night. The driver had fled the scene, and Michael had succumbed to his injuries before help arrived. The case had remained unsolved. Jack's hands shook as he closed the tab. This was no coincidence. 2 calls from people who had been dead for decades, both calling him, sharing fragments of their last moments. What was happening? Over the next few nights, the pattern continued. Jack received more calls, each one from a voice that seemed to echo from the past. Or a woman named Linda, who had died in a house fire in 1991. A young boy, Danny, who had drowned in the river in 1972. Each story was tragic, their voices filled with confusion and fear, as if they were reliving their final moments. Jack began to keep a detailed log of each call, noting the names, dates, and details of the deaths. A haunting realization began to dawn on him. Every death had occurred within a 5-mile radius of the station. It was as if the radio waves themselves were pulling these voices from the ether, connecting Jack to a forgotten web of tragedy. The breaking point came one night when Jack received a call from a voice he recognized immediately. Sarah Connelly. "Jack," she said, her voice steadier than before. "You've been listening, haven't you?" Jack gripped the microphone tightly. "Sarah, I have. I've spoken to others, people like you." "I know," Sarah said. "That's why I called again, and you're the only one who can help us." Jack swallowed hard. "What do you mean? How can I help?" "You have to listen carefully," Sarah said. "There's a reason we're reaching out to you. There's something tying us here, something keeping us from moving on." "What is it?" Jack asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah's voice cracked with emotion. "There's a man. He He took something from us, from all of us. Jack's pulse quickened. Who? Sarah, who are you talking about? Before she could answer, the static grew louder, drowning out her voice. Jack shouted her name into the microphone, but the line went dead. Jack sat in stunned silence, his mind racing. A man, someone who had wronged all of them. Was this the key to the mystery? He sifted through his notes, scanning the names and dates. If there was a connection, it wasn't immediately obvious, but one thing was clear. These weren't just random voices from the past. They were part of something larger, a story waiting to be uncovered. And Jack was at the center of it. As the first rays of dawn crept through the studio window, Jack made a decision. He would find out who this man was, he would find out what had happened, and he would do whatever it took to help the voices find peace. Jack Harlan couldn't stop thinking about Sarah's final words. There's a man. He took something from us, from all of us. Her voice, filled with fear and desperation, echoed in his mind. What could tie together decades of tragedies? And who was this man? As dawn broke over the city, Jack sat in his apartment surrounded by notes and printouts. He had spent hours poring over the names, dates, and details of every caller he had logged. There was a connection. There had to be. Each death had occurred within a small radius of the radio station, and many involved unexplained circumstances. Accidents, disappearances, murders, but no single thread tied them all together. Not yet. That evening, Jack returned to the station with a sense of foreboding. The weight of the calls had begun to take its toll. He felt like he was being watched, the shadows in the studio seeming darker and deeper than usual. The red glow of the on-air sign felt like a warning. At midnight, Jack started his broadcast, his voice steady despite the unease twisting in his gut. Good evening, night owls, he said. This is the midnight hour, and the lines are open. Tell me what's on your mind. He played a jazz track, leaning back in his chair as the music filled the studio. But his mind wasn't on the airwaves. He was waiting for another voice, another clue. The phone rang, and his stomach clenched. You're on the midnight hour. This is Jack. The static on the line was faint but unmistakable. Then came a new voice, deep and gravelly, with a hint of menace. Hello, Jack. Jack's blood ran cold. This voice wasn't like the others. It wasn't trembling or scared. It was calm, controlled. Who's this? Jack asked, his voice edged with suspicion. Just someone who's been listening. The voice replied. You've been quite busy, haven't you? Talking to all those lost souls. Jack's grip on the microphone tightened. Who are you? What do you want? The voice chuckled, low and chilling. You're looking for answers, Jack, but some questions are better left unanswered. Let it go. Stop digging. Jack's pulse pounded in his ears. Are you the man Sarah was talking about? Are you the one who... The line went dead. Jack sat frozen, his heart hammering. Whoever had called wasn't a ghost. They were alive, and they knew what he was doing. For the first time, Jack felt real fear. He wasn't just dealing with voices from the past anymore. Someone, somewhere, was watching him. He grabbed his notes and left the studio as soon as his shift ended, heading straight to the diner where Sarah had worked before her death. The place was still standing, though its neon sign flickered and the interior looked worn. A few older patrons sipped coffee at the counter, and a tired-looking waitress greeted Jack with a half-smile. What can I get you? She asked, setting a menu on the counter. Just coffee, Jack said. And I was wondering if you knew Sarah Connelly. She worked here years ago. The waitress's smile faded. I remember Sarah, she said softly. Sweet girl. What's this about? Jack hesitated. I'm trying to piece together what happened to her. She's connected to something I'm investigating. The waitress frowned. Her death was a tragedy, but if you're looking for answers, you should talk to Frank. He worked here back then. He might know more. He lives just down the block. Jack found Frank in a small apartment above a hardware store. The old man's face was lined with age, but his eyes were sharp. He listened intently as Jack explained his search, though Jack left out the supernatural details. When Jack mentioned Sarah, Frank's expression darkened. Sarah was a good kid, he said. She didn't deserve what happened. Do you know who killed her? Jack asked. Frank hesitated, then sighed. There was always talk about someone in the neighborhood, a man who liked to take advantage of young women. People whispered, but no one ever did anything. Sarah wasn't the first, and she wasn't the last. Who was he? Jack pressed. They called him Old Joe, Frank said. He ran a junkyard near the edge of town on this, but he disappeared years ago. Some folks said he skipped town. Others said karma caught up with him. Jack's mind raced as he left Frank's apartment. The pieces were starting to fit together. If Old Joe had preyed on women like Sarah and others in the area, it could explain the connection between the voices. But how was Joe tied to the station, and why were the voices calling him? That night, Jack returned to the station, determined to confront whatever force was reaching out to him. He sat in the dim studio, staring at the phone, waiting for it to ring. At 2:45 a.m. it did. "You're on the midnight hour. This is Jack." It was Sarah. "Jack," she said, her voice stronger than before. "You're close. You found his name." "Old Joe," Jack said. "He's the one who hurt you. But why are you calling me?" "He was buried," Sarah said. "Buried beneath the station. That's why we're here. That's why we can't leave." Jack's breath caught. "Beneath the station? How do I—" "Find him, Jack," Sarah said. "Find him and we'll finally be free." The next day, Jack approached the building's janitor, a grizzled man named Ed. He asked about the station's history, and Ed revealed that the building had once been a junkyard before it was converted into a studio. Jack's blood ran cold. With Ed's reluctant help, Jack accessed the basement, a dark, musty space filled with old equipment and cobwebs. As he searched, his flashlight flickered, the air growing colder. Then he saw it, a patch of concrete that didn't match the rest of the floor. Jack grabbed a crowbar and pried at the edges. The concrete gave way, revealing a shallow grave. Bones, old and brittle, but unmistakably human. The discovery made headlines. Forensic analysis confirmed the remains belonged to a man who had died decades ago, Joseph Old Joe Harrington. With his body uncovered, the voices stopped. Jack's show returned to normal, though he knew he would never forget the calls. The voices had been trapped, tethered by the darkness that lingered beneath the station. Now, they were free. As Jack sat in the studio one quiet night, he glanced at the phone, half expecting it to ring. But the only sound was the soft hum of jazz in the background. For the first time in weeks, the silence felt peaceful.